second case study was an apostasy and freedom of belief, and that's another major issue that you discuss. It's the question whether leaving Islam carries a worldly punishment, and this topic is extremely relevant today because it touches on religious freedom. So questions regarding that are, first of all, does the Quran prescribe a worldly punishment for apostasy? If not, again, how did the idea of punishment for apostasy become so widespread in classical jurisprudence? And how does the Farahi School interpret these texts differently?
Sure. So, again, when it comes to apostasy, we have the same puzzle and the same issue that we had with stoning, which means there's absolutely no verse in the Quran that says if somebody leaves the religion of Islam, that person needs to be punished in this world. There's no verse about that. In fact, a number of verses in the Quran that talk about people who leave Islam talks about them in a way that it appreciates that they live their own natural life and then they die in an old age. And of course, then says that they will be punished in the hereafter. But it doesn't say anything about punishment in the world. Okay, where it is coming from, there are some ahadith. For instance, man baddala deenahu faqtuluh. Whoever changed his religion, kill him. And some reports as well that, for instance, in some places, some of the companions killed somebody because apparently that person left Islam. Interestingly enough, I forgot to say, let me just say this, that for the case of stoning, when you look at the traditional tafasir, you find that most of the mufassirs, most of the people who interpret the Quran, when they read that verse about 100 lashing, they simply say, yes, this verse is for fornication, and of course for adultery we know that the punishment is stoning. They just pass it very easily, as if this is something that is very obvious. Interestingly enough, when it comes to apostasy, the tafasir that I looked at, none of them really invests on any verse of the Quran to say, yes, this verse, from this verse we understand that the punishment of apostasy is killing. It's not even there. It seems to coming from hadith. It seems to coming from some reports. The way that the Farahi scholars see that, and I know this is going to be the topic of one of our sessions in future, they relate this to the Sunnah of the Almighty at the time of the prophets. In fact, one of the principles of the Farahi school of thought, which again makes them different from the traditional scholars, is that they identify some of the things that happened at the time of the prophet to not be part of Sharia, but be part of the Sunnatullah at the time of the prophet. The meaning of that is that as soon as you say Sunnatullah at the time of the Prophet, that means that after the era of the Prophet, it's not applicable at all. So this Sunnatullah at the time of the Prophet, as they have explained it, and I'm going to be very brief about it because I know we'll talk about it later, is a concept of Itmam al-Hujja and Enzar, or completing the reasoning and warning. Basically what they say is that when a messenger of God, a Rasul, comes to any people, his mission is to do itmam al-hujjah for them, which means to make the truth so evident and so clear, crystal clear for them, that no doubt stays in their hearts. Nobody could say, oh, I wasn't convinced. When that point reaches, then those who still do not accept this truth and go against it, these are the ones who will be called kafir. You know, kafir in Arabic means the person who covers something. What is it that they are covering? They are covering the truth. They know the truth, yet they cover it. Okay? Why they do that? They do it out of arrogance, out of takabbur, which I know you have some questions about that we'll talk about it later. So then, according to this understanding of Sunnatullah, once the messenger gets to the end of the Itmam al-Hujjah, completion of reasoning, and Inzar, which is warning, then punishment, worldly punishment, comes for the people who are still rejecting their message. Not because they are not convinced, but because they, out of arrogance, are not accepting the truth and are even going against it. The Farahi scholars say that it is because of this Sunnatullah that if somebody would leave Islam at the time of the Prophet, that person was punishable. Because think about it, the formula that I gave you, so according to this formula, if somebody leaves Islam at the time of the Prophet, after Itmam al-Hujjah, he has put himself in the army of kafirin, the people who out of arrogance has rejected the truth. So then worldly punishment would be applicable to them. This is their understanding. And in this way, they justify any hadith that is about killing an apostate and any report of killing apostasy. And my own view, in one word, I fully agree with that. So that's a very brief explanation of this. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that explanation. I think that was I think you elaborated just enough for us to move to the third case study, which is about hijab and interpretation. So you also explore that topic, which is one of the most visible and often debated aspects of Islam today. And your analysis looks closely at the Quranic verses themselves. So again, I think because this is such a hotly debated topic, many people are aware of the verses that are usually cited in discussions about hijab, but just to take it from a beginner level, I'd like you to please, introduce us to the verses that are usually cited in discussions about hijab, and how does the Farahi approach interpret these verses? And just a very, I think, almost self-explanatory question, which is, do you think cultural traditions sometimes influence how religious texts are understood?
Yeah, so that's a very good question to start this topic, the topic of hijab. Again, it is something that we can discuss it in more detail later. But basically, the traditional view, of course, is that women, when they reach the age of maturity, they need to cover their head, basically their hair. Some people even go as far as saying that they need to cover their face, which of course we know that most Muslims do not agree with that, and they just cover their hair. Again, the issue here is that, strictly speaking, there's no verse of the Quran that explicitly and categorically say you need to cover your hair. Okay, so we have the same problem here. This problem remains. There's no evidence, there's no explicit instruction about it in the Quran. When you look at the literature, in particular academic literature, you find that there are certain explanations about how this came to become obligation. Of course, some agree that yes, from the verses of the Quran you can derive that. So we will discuss it later. But those who believe that no, this is not really part of the verse of the Quran, there are different views about how this came to be a common practice among many Muslims and Muslim women. And so it's not; these are not mutually exclusive, meaning that it can be all of them together as well. So one view, for instance, is that the whole hijab and covering hair and covering the whole body of women, basically, was actually the influence of territories that Muslims captured later including Persia, which is Iran, my own country. Because if you read the history of Persia and Iran, women at that time, many of them, those who belong to the higher levels of society, they used to be behind parda, behind sort of cover. They would consider themselves to be so elevated that not everybody would be allowed to even look at them. So some argue that this was actually the influence of the culture here that went into Arabia. There are some arguments or some other arguments that say that it wasn't really the Quran, it wasn't really the Prophet, but it was some of the companions of the Prophet, like the second Khalifa, who were very strict about women in the society, and it was actually their influence that made this hijab something that everybody needed to do. You talked about culture and how that may affect the way that people think about this. Some people, in particular female scholars, they argue from more feminism perspective, and they say, well, look at the scholars of Islam. How many women do you find among them? So always in the history of Islam, up to contemporary times, of course, when we do have some great female scholars who interpret the Quran, but before that, all the people who interpreted the Quran were among men. So what else do you expect? So they just see this from men's perspective. So yes, the main issue really is that if you look at the verses in the Quran, so there are two verses in the Quran. The first one is in Surah Ahzab, verse number 59. Ya ayyuhan nabi qul li azwajika wa banatik wa nisa'il mu'minin yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihin. O Prophet, say to your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers that they let down upon them their overgarments, the jalabib. That would be one verse. There's two problems if we try to interpret covering of hair from this verse. Number one is that this yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihin, let down upon them their overgarments. It can be interpreted in many ways, not necessarily covering the hair. But the more important problem is the one that the Farahi School of Thought, in particular Javed Ahmad Ghamidi, says here. And that is that, look, the verse is not really about hijab. Look at the chapter 33, chapter of Ahzab. The issue here was that there were some people, hypocrites, munafiqeen, that would annoy believer women in the streets. And when the Muslims would tell them, why do you do this behavior with our women? They would say, oh, sorry, we didn't know that these were among the believers. We thought these were just bad women in the city that are always with men. So then the verse says, well, yudnina alayhinna min jalabibihin, and bring upon you this cloth, so that they realize that you are women of your believer women. And then it says, if they still then annoy you, then we will know how to deal with them. So what Javed Ahmad Ghamidi argues is that, look at this. This is not about hijab. This is about not dressing like women who in the society are known as bad women. Women are, I don't want to say bad women, but women who are happy to be with men, with any man, And so what he says is that, for instance, it could be that if in a society, women who are like that always read, let's say, I don't know, red colored dress, yeah? Then the verse could say, do not wear red colored dress, okay? Choose a different color so that they know that you're not among those women. And this is a very sensible instruction even today. I mean, I'm sure every sane person would say, well, you do not dress in a way that if you go to society, they think that they can basically misuse you and do whatever they want with you, and you're happy with that. Okay, so what Javed Ghamidi says is that Surah Ahzab has nothing to do with hijab. Let me just put a footnote. The reason here I'm not saying what Farahi scholars are saying, I'm saying what Ustad Qamidi says, is that in this he disagrees with his Ustad Amin Ahsan Islahi. Amin Ahsan Islahi believes in hijab the same way that traditional scholars believe. So Javed Ahmad Qamidi has a different view here. So then there's only one verse, according to Javed Ahmad Qamidi, that really deals with hijab. And that is verse number 31 of Surah An-Nur, the 24th surah of the Quran. وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. And say to the believing women that they cast down their looks and guard their private parts and do not display their ornaments except what is apparent thereof, and put their head covering, which is khimar, over their bosoms. The debate here is about this part. وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. Khumur means, normally refers to a piece of cloth that women had on their head. It says, use this to cover your bosom as well. Because we know from the history that it was quite custom that many Arab women had something on their head, on their head, but many of them had their bosoms totally naked and it was visible. So it says, use this, cover that. The traditional scholars are saying, because it says use this, so therefore, see, covering the head is also wajib, obligatory. Javed Ahmad Qamidi says, if Quran wants to make something obligatory, it says it explicitly. It does not refer to it implicitly. Because women had this cover, it just says use this cover to cover your bosom. If they had this cover on their back, for instance, it would say use that cover to cover your bosom. Use that cloth to cover your bosom. So it's just asking them to use the most obvious and practical cloth that they had to cover their bosom. That's the whole idea. And to add to that, he also argues, which is true, of course, historically, that the reason women had cover on their head before coming of Islam, that wasn't because of any religious reason, that wasn't because of piety or something. It was just the custom of the time because of the weather and everything. Even today you can see in many countries people have it because of the way that the weather is. So that's what he says. But then there is a complexity here, and that's where I have a different view. Before I go into that, was what I said clear to you? Is there any part that is unclear?
No, it's I've understood it clearly, but there is a slight confusion on the verse about drawing your outer garments to be recognized. So now I'm not exactly sure about the chronology of whether zina was always supposed to be something that was forbidden. But in case it was, because in other religions as well, that was the case, right? So the fact that if it refers to certain women to cover themselves with their outer garments, is it still not granting permission to the men at that time to still indulge in zina with women that they think that they can indulge with?
Yes, it's a very good question. It's not, see, Irtiqa, it's not about granting them that permission. It's about dealing with something that was existing in the society. Okay? So Islam was still establishing in that society. And as you know, even today in almost all Muslim countries, there is something going on in terms of official zina, basically. So this is just something that happens, just like theft, for instance. No matter how much your society is good, you always have some thieves in the society. Okay, so it was something that was existing in that society. Yes, there were men who were looking for women, and there were women who were happy and easy about it, although Islam was still establishing. And the verse is seeing this situation and then he's seeing that these men are actually misuse these conditions to sometimes make disturbance for believer women, and the verse is trying to stop that. Yeah.
So I take that this means that maybe those men were being looked at as almost a lost cause, and then there was a particular segment of people that could have been protected, and so the focus was on them for the time being, at least.
Well, yes, I mean, the focus was on believers. And those men, the Quran refers to them as munafiqeen, hypocrites, which is not a very good title, okay, hypocrites. So, yes, the Quran does not approve them, of course, and does not approve their behavior, of course. Yeah, and also, it's not that necessarily their disturbance or their behavior was going as far as zina. Just disturbing women. Just disturbing them, like sometimes in many cities in some countries you find men just disturbing some women without really getting into zina and all that sort of. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so then comes the complicated part, which I try to explain it as brief and as clear as I can. The complicated part is this part. It says, وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنْ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. So it says that do not display their ornaments except what is apparent thereof. The traditional scholars believe that what is apparent thereof is hands and feet, basically. Ustad Qamadi agrees with that. He also says, yes, it's hands and feet. And then Ustad Qamadi considers zina here to mean ornaments, embellishment, literal embellishment, something external to your body. So then what he concludes from this is that because hair is not part of what is apparent thereof, and people used to cover their head anyway, so then if you put zina, embellishment on your hair, you then need to cover it. But if there's no embellishment on your hair, you don't need to cover it. Of course, he also says that covering hair is a good thing to do. So he doesn't say don't cover your hair. He says it was always part of Abrahamic religions and many other religions that women cover their head. So it's absolutely something very good to do. But it is not obligatory unless you have zina, embellishment on your hair. Okay? And here comes the difficulty and problem. Because I give you a very extreme example, but an example that is still true. Imagine a woman puts so much embellishment on her hair that you cannot see her hair anymore. Yeah? So according to this understanding, you need to cover that. Yeah? But if a woman does not have any embellishment and just beautiful hair, according to this understanding, you do not need to cover that. Yeah? I found this to be quite difficult to go with. And I don't want to elaborate on this more, but it comes to the point that, for instance, for the bosom, based on this understanding, you may come to understanding that you need to cover your bosom, and then if there is embellishment at the top of that cover, you need to cover that one as well. Now, I'm not saying this is what Ustad Qamadi says, but I'm saying that with this formula, you can come up with that outcome and say, well, then I come up with this. And of course, I'm sure Ustad Qamadi will answer that, but there's difficulty there. I disagree with two things here. Number one is that the word zina in the Quran, in my understanding, does not necessarily mean that embellishment. I agree with Imam Razi, who in Tafsir Kabir explains zina and says zina is anything attractive about women. So it can be part of the body or it can be embellishment, but anything attractive. And I disagree that illa ma dhahara minha, something that is displayed thereof in normal way. I disagree that it is just hand and feet. I disagree with that. And then to argue that head was always covered. Ustad Qamidi argues that it was tradition of all human beings to cover their head. But at certain point in the history, they just left that. I disagree with that. I mean, Ustad Qamidi is not historian. I'm not a historian. He's not socialist. I'm not a socialist. I think it's difficult to argue with that, argue like that. And I think if really hand and feet was the point here, instead of having illa ma dhahara minha, the verse would say except their hand and feet. Why the verse needs to make it so general? So based on that, and again I'm talking about this very briefly, my understanding, Irtiqa, about hijab is that what the verse is actually saying is that you should cover any part of your body that is beyond the norm of your society. So you need to look at the norm of your society. If the norm of your society is something that, for instance, you need to cover your hand up to elbow, yeah, then you as a believer need to do that. Because if you don't do that, you are going against the norm of that society, and that can create, difficulties. That can create impurity for you and for others. And of course, there is a limit, because when I say that, you may say, well, hang on, what if the norm of society is being nude? Then does that then mean that yet we can be nude? No, because the verse, first of all, says, وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ, so the private parts need to be covered. And then the verse has put a limit for that norm of society. And that limit is the part that says, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, they need to cover their bosoms. So as long as the person covers their bosom, the woman, as long as they cover the private parts, the rest of it, neck, head, etc., all depends on the norm of that society. And I think that is something very practical, something very rational as well. And what I get from this verse. I know women who are very pious, and when they go, for instance, to some of the gatherings, they do not cover their head, because it's totally norm in that gathering that nobody covers their head. But sometimes when they go to some other gatherings where all women are covering their head, they also cover their head. That's not because they are afraid of that society. That's not because they are hypocrites or anything. No, they think that, well, for this society, it is only appropriate that I keep my head covered because of the norm of that society. And that is what, according to my understanding, the verse is saying.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, yes, and thank you for that explanation. And that brings us to the last of the case study that you chose, which is the return of
Jesus.
Jesus, another
Exactly.
fascinating subject, the belief in the return of Jesus. And many Muslims believe that Jesus will physically return before the end of time. And I think, if they come across anybody who goes against that belief or who holds a different belief, I think for them, it's not just a textual difference. I think they're so emotionally invested in that future that it's almost like an emotional shock to them as well. So it's difficult for them to accept it on multiple levels. But is this belief, again, rooted directly in the Quran, or does it, again, come primarily from Hadith literature? And how does the Farahi School approach this question?
Yes. So you explained that very well. This is a common belief among most of the Muslims, Shia and Sunni. And again, we have the same problem that when you look at the Quran, you don't find any evidence of it, any categorical information about it in the Quran. You see, there are things that we do not expect to see in the Quran. Okay, so If somebody says, I believe such and such and such and such thing happened in the past or will happen in the future, if somebody says, well, but we don't have it in the Quran, that's a stupid argument, because the Quran is not supposed to give us full information about past and future. But there are topics that the Quran is interested in. One of those topics is what will happen near the end of the world. The Quran has elaborated on that. As a shamsu kubirat. The Quran talks about Ya'juj and Ma'juj and all that. Now, what the interpretation of those are, we will talk about it later. With the Dabba, this creature that comes from the earth. How come the Quran talks about this creature from the earth and Ya'juj and Ma'juj, and then does not talk about return of Jesus, one of the most beloved prophets in the Quran? How come? This is very strange. So again, when you look at the literature and you can look at academic literature, you will see there is a strong view there that this was the effect of Christian beliefs that entered Islam, maybe even by some of the converts from Christians who became Muslims, and they kept that belief with them, and then they looked at the verses of the Quran and they tried to interpret these verses according to their beliefs. So in the Quran there is a verse that says in Surah Al Imran, إِذْ قَالَ اللَّهُ يَا عِيسَى إِنِّي مُتَوَفِّيكَ وَرَافِعُكَ إِلَيَّ. Oh Jesus, I will take you to me and will raise you to me. Okay? Now, this I will take you to me, because in my book, in order to not impose my own understanding, I tried to translate the verses in a way that is not too different from the common translation. So, inni mutawafiq, I put, I will take you to me. But actually, literally, inni mutawafiq means I cause you death. Okay? Now, in the tafsir, you find lots of elaboration by the scholars trying to say, no, mutawafiq here does not mean cause you death. It seems completing something and therefore taking you to myself. And they argue like that. So, again, here, Ustad Ahmadi has a different view from his teacher, Amir Ahsan Islam. So, what Ahmadi says that, he says that no, the verse is very explicit. He says, Inni mutawafiq, wafat. Says, I will cause you death. It's what the verse is saying. And there's no verse in the Quran that categorically informs us that Jesus will return. Yes, there are verses that people try to interpret it in that way, but I don't want to go to those details, but there's no verse that categorically say that. Just for people who might be interested, one of the verses that people try to interpret as if it says Jesus will come back is verse number 159 in Surah Nisa, or verse number 46 in Surah Al Imran, which I'm not going to go to that detail. So yes, according to Ustad Ahmadi, there's no information in the Quran that Jesus will come back. And there is no reason for Jesus to come back, because Jesus completed his mission. That Itmam al-Hujjah that we talked about. He completed the mission, and that's it. And my own opinion, I totally agree with this. I fully agree with this. There are some challenges and issues, as I have written in my book, about some of the details, like exactly what happened, or what exactly the verse means when it says, وَرَافِعُكَ إِلَيَّ, I raise you to me. What exactly that means? Does it mean that I raise your spirit to myself, or I raise your body to myself, or what exactly that means? There are some challenges and issues there, but on the main point that the Quran is totally silent about return of Jesus, I fully agree. What Javed Ahmad Qamezi says is that, of course, God can do anything he wants, okay? So this is not to say Jesus will not come back. God may want to bring back any prophet that he wants, but we don't have that information in the Quran. And it's very strange if this is part of God's plan when the Quran is silent about it.